and welcome to this York Festival of Ideas event, Caring and Coping, Exploring NHS Paramedics. So my name is Liz Harris. I am the Head of Professional Standards at the College of Paramedics, and I'm also a paramedic for Yorkshire Ambulance Service. I'm very, very happy to be here today. So I'm here today with Leo McCann. Leo is a Professor of Management at the York Management School. Leo's teaching and research is interdisciplinary in nature, exploring the complexities and contradictions of management work and globalisation through qualitative inquiry in both contemporary and historical contexts. Leo, I'm very pleased, has published this first in-depth sociological study of paramedics in England. And in his book, he shares his insights from his extensive investigation of the paramedic profession through hours and hours of observation shifts on the back of an ambulance and in the rapid response cars attending the 999 emergencies that come through. I'm sure most would agree that paramedics and ambulance services have traditionally provided a critical and crucial role in the delivery of immediate and emergency healthcare in the UK. But more recently, it's probably accurate to say that society and the system as a whole has become increasingly reliant on ambulance services to deliver less urgent healthcare too. And this is in the context of increasing social inequalities, overstretched and chronically underfunded NHS, and of course, the global pandemic, all of which impact hugely on the work of the paramedic. And so for me, as someone that's grown up in the ambulance service over many years, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Leo to understand how he saw the ambulance service and how he views the paramedic profession. So welcome, Leo. Are you with me?
Hi there. Hi, thanks so much for hosting this call. It's great to be taking part in this.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, absolutely. So shall we start reminding people that there is the Q&A function, and we'll start and we'll do some chatting and I'll ask you some questions, Leo, if that's all right.
Sounds great.
Okay, so let's start with a bit of a background to your book. And I'm interested to know where the idea came from. What made you decide to explore paramedics?
So I've been doing a lot of work on various occupations and professions and organisations over the years. So I tend to take a kind of a sociological approach to looking at the kind of, as your intro said, the kind of complexities of those roles and the kind of weird and wonderful things that happen in organizations, right? So previous work has looked at corporate managers, banking, insurance, automotive, various different industries. And I've always taken kind of a qualitative approach, right? So interviews, gathering people's personal stories, anecdotes, trying to explain that workplace from the ground up, so to speak. And after doing several projects of this kind, I then with some colleagues did some work on the NHS, looking at 4 different NHS trusts, 4 different types of NHS trusts as well, which is quite interesting. So hospital, what was a PCT before they were disbanded, ambulance trust, and a psychiatric care foundation trust. So looking at those 4 different types of organisation, I found the ambulance to be completely fascinating. So I was a group of 4 of us doing this research, but I spent most of my time looking at an ambulance trust, predominantly looking at the managers, but also what struck me as so interesting was that many of the mid-level managers were actually practicing paramedics, supervisors, clinical team leaders, people of that nature who were very close to the line. You know, there's this kind of idea that somehow there's too many managers, or that NHS is clogged up with managers and process. But what I found actually was that many of these people who were called managers were also clinicians of various kinds, right? So anyway, cut a long story short, completed that study. And towards the end of that study, I was kind of allowed to do some further investigations of more frontline stuff, not just the managers, but to go on some observational shifts, which is something that they do in ambulance services, how the students learn. I was basically in that sort of position on a vehicle, observing some shifts. And then subsequently I did lots of interviews, private interviews, kind of one-to-one interviews with paramedics who volunteered to take part in the study. And I gathered a huge amount of stories, right? And I just realized that this is one of the most interesting occupations I've ever seen. And I thought this is going to have to turn into a book. There's just so much here. And that's the kind of potted history of the project.
And it's been a labour of love, has it? How long have you been working on this book now?
Yeah, a long time. So the actual research was done quite a long time before the book came out. As you know, kind of a very long lead time. Something kind of got in the way a little bit a couple of years ago, and up until now. So it's taken a very long time to make sense of all of it and to write it up. And the book's just been published now. So really, the whole thing, from conception of the idea back doing the previous study, that was way back in sort of 2009. So I've been thinking about this in some form for 10, 11, 12 years. So it's pretty exhausting thing to take on, but it has been a labor of love. As I say, I've found the whole thing to be fascinating and in many ways quite humbling, actually, to see a very complex reality that paramedics inhabit. And it's been a really important learning experience for me.
Mm. So what were you trying to achieve with this book then, in terms of its overall purpose, and what would you say are its main messages, Leo?
Yes, great question. I think really overall it looks at this kind of transition. One of the things that struck me was that people would talk a great deal about how paramedic world has changed. And in some sense, it's a story of huge advancement, right? So there's this idea of a professionalization strategy that's been explicitly going on with people like yourself from the College of Paramedics, but various other actors as well, in terms of basically enhancing the clinical capacity of the ambulance, or various ambulance roles, particularly the paramedic role, right? So in years gone by, we wouldn't really have talked of a profession of paramedics. We would have thought more likely to talk of it maybe as an occupation. The ambulance, as an institution, was there to really provide basic first aid and transportation, right? The original models of most ambulance delivery systems that we have in most of the kind of, particularly in the Anglophone English-speaking world, is rapid response, stabilization of patients and transport of patients, an emergency service with relatively limited clinical input, right? It was predominantly a rapid response system. That's its roots. But I was struck by how those roots no longer really capture the whole scenario now. So it's really the whole book looks at that story of how an occupation becomes a profession, right? And what that means, and what that means for the people occupying that profession. What does it mean if the paramedic role has changed? What does it mean if the paramedic role has become more clinically advanced? On many ways, this means progress, both for the profession and for the patients, right? It's a more clinically advanced, versatile resource that can do more for the patient, doesn't necessarily transport every patient to hospital, can deal with patient issues on scene. All of these things are interesting forms of change. And so it really tries to describe what changing from an occupation to a profession means. And like I say, what are the benefits to the patients and to the practitioners from that change process?
Yeah. So we might come back to a couple of things you've mentioned there in a minute, if that's all right. But
of course.
So yeah. So what about, you said you spent lots of time observing, you also did the interviews as well, but there's lots of observing hours where you no doubt put on a nice little high-vis jacket and became part of that ambulance crew. I'm sure you did. I'm sure you were you were up front and center at some point, but then also probably maybe wanted to fade into the background.
Yeah, very much so.
So how was that for you?
Observing was really strange. I mean, it's an established part of, as I say, the ambulance trust's kind of training, and indeed the paramedic science degrees. The students will go on these observations, and they'll do dozens and dozens of them. I did a very relatively small amount of these, but the experience was really, really interesting. And I suppose the thing that struck me first of all was just the intensity and the busyness. I mean, I knew it was busy, but to experience it and to witness it was very, very interesting. So, literally to the point of appearing at the ambulance station, and the crew would book on to their shift, and there'd be a bit of chit chat around the crew members, who's on station, how's it been going, how are things, people just sort of swapping gossip a little bit. But then soon as the shift starts, there'd be a call dispatched to that crew pretty much instantly. I mean, maybe you've got a short wait, but pretty much you're mobilized immediately. So that was very interesting to learn just how busy that was. Now I kind of come at it thinking, well, what's a blue light run? You're kind of assuming that's relatively rare. You're thinking as an outsider, you see ambulances tearing around with lights on, the sirens blaring, but you think they must be going to some major incident. But they're doing that pretty much all the time. I mean, you know all about this. You do 8, 9, 10 of these, maybe more in a shift. On the car, there'd be even more. They'd be mobilized even more regularly. So driving on blue lights, really a lot of that shift. And then, get to a call. Calls can take quite a long time to in terms of what to do with the patient, what the patient wants, what the nature of the complaint is, etc. Onward transportation possibly. And then as soon as they're cleared off that call, greening up off the call, straight away get another one, right? So very rarely getting back to base station. You get back there for the mandated kind of lunch break, or, meal break. But beyond that, constant mobilization, which to see and to witness was interesting, but very, very, very exhausting. I knew it would be kind of a tough environment, but to physically experience that was interesting. That's the first thing that struck me. It's strange being kind of an artificial kind of role, observing, but the crews would explain what they were doing. They would they kind of treated me like a student on the vehicle, which was interesting, and learned an amazing amount from doing that.
Yeah, and so that was the tiredness and the relentlessness of it. You've mentioned there. Was that one of the most surprising elements, or what did strike you most, and what were you surprised about from that? What in terms of your expectations?
I wouldn't say I was surprised to learn it was like that, but to actually feel some of that physical demands of the dislocation, right? The amount of traveling was interesting. A lot long distances, traveling quite far, depending on what location you're in, but often quite a lot of moving around. The metaphors people used to describe that were interesting. They'd say things like, they'd describe it as ping pong. We're doing ping pong today, or they'd say that one guy I remember talked about a river of calls. So you complete that call, you declare the crew is ready for the next call, and in comes the next one like a river, like a sea of calls. People use very interesting metaphors. I found that to experience some of that myself, but also to have it described both on scene or in the interviews was really, really interesting for me. So lots of good material to work with as a researcher in terms of describing and characterizing that environment as a very intense, very demanding role. I wouldn't say it was surprising, but it was just interesting to experience it. I suppose in terms of what I didn't expect, I guess the volume of what you might categorize as urgent care, urgent primary care, unplanned primary care. And of course I kind of knew that this was an issue, but to see quite how many of the calls were basically quite low acuity, or low clinical seriousness. This is a source of huge frustration in the service, really, and how different crews accounted for that was interesting. Some would be quite dismissive of those sorts of calls and would describe them as boring and we shouldn't be going to them. Others said, well, who else is going to do it? We can cope with these calls quite well. They're normally quite easy. They're not stressful. It was quite interesting to learn different personalities in a service, right? I mean, you're exposed to the same things, but people interpreted them differently, experienced them differently, explained them differently, right?
Mm. Yeah, and so can you expand a little bit there on what it's like, what you think it's like to be a paramedic in terms of the ambulance cultural aspect and that kind of identity of being a paramedic? That
was one of the upsides to all of this, right? That was really quite important to, I think, almost everyone I met would talk quite a lot about enjoying that status of the role and wearing the uniform and having the paramedic word on the epaulettes is quite important to people. I mean, a lot of people in the general public wouldn't know the difference between a paramedic and another type of role on the vehicle, but I think everyone liked to be sharing in that culture of serving the public, not knowing what's coming next. People liked that and said it was interesting. They said they were outdoorsy type people, right? They would talk about the pleasures of working outside on a vehicle among the public, not trapped in an office, not drowning in paperwork and going to boring meetings. They loved that. They were active, proactive types. And the work has that kind of attractiveness. It's direct, it's immediate. You don't always know what's happened to the patient. In fact, you often don't know what happened to the patient after the incident, right? And after you've dropped them off at hospital, etc. But you do get to have done something there and then. And sometimes you've played a hugely important role for someone who's in distress. And they use this word of privilege. They'd say regularly that this job is a privilege. And that meant it's very important socially. You can get to do a lot of good in the role. But the flip side is you have to tolerate a lot of stuff that isn't so good, right? But that was the kind of price worth paying, I think, for many, many people. I mean, people are leaving. I'm sure we'll get to that. Some people are struggling with their own health and aren't in a good place. That was true for many people. But the flip side is that they'll say the job is important, the job is rarely boring, and there's a great culture. There's some kind of culture around the place that's kind of intoxicating. You kind of get drawn in, and you enjoy that culture. A lot of working with people of the same approach, same attitudes, swapping stories. Learning from one another. It was a really interesting culture to study. So it had all of those, difficult elements, but the upsides of the job were very high. And it's hard to imagine a job that provides those highs, a different type of job, right? I mean, where else do you get to help people? Where else do you get to drive these powerful vehicles? And there's an element of romance to it, right? Which people were a bit cynical about, but was definitely there. And I think people they were proud of their role, proud to be playing a part in this.
Yeah, I'm going to take a question from Liv at that point because it probably kind of links in. So Liv's saying, do you think the strong but perhaps short-lived messages around the importance of frontline key workers during the pandemic, do you think that that's had a positive impact or perhaps in some way been damaging for paramedics? Because it hasn't lasted, has it? And ultimately improved anything in a practical sense. So what are your thoughts on that, Leo?
No, that's a great question. I mean, the pandemic was interesting because I think the initial reaction, they kind of clapped for carers and that aspect. I think a lot of the paramedics, I mean, I wasn't doing the research at that time, obviously. This is the discussions with people subsequently, right? So, and then my interpretation subsequently. But my feeling is that this ties, when it does tie into my research, is that there's this kind of public idea of like the paramedic as hero, right? And you see this on the TV shows, 999, what's your emergency, whatever they're, helicopter heroes, etc. There's dozens of these, right? And they tend to have, not all of them, but they tend to reinforce this view of the kind of stoic, I'll cope with anything, throw me into this, some terrible scene and I'll cope with it. This kind of very tough, uncompromising people who can cope with anything, right? I think clapping for carers or clapping for heroes, whatever it was called, was much the same sort of thing. It was like, thank you, NHS. I think it was heartfelt to a degree. I think it was quite heartfelt because people were scared, people were frightened, people were getting very ill, people were dying. People looked to the NHS as something to help them, which they would do, and that's right. But the hero narrative and the clapping thing, there's a danger in focusing on that to the point where we're not looking at these people as professionals, as employees, with a need to be treated with dignity and given the time to develop, the time to reflect. I think a lot of people in the service, and this is in the NHS more broadly, a lot of people feel undervalued. And that's very sad, right? Given the fact that society respects and looks to our healthcare practitioners to help us regularly, right? We depend on them heavily. And yet there's a feeling that, the terms and conditions could be better. The management of that resource could be fairer. I mean, people are run ragged was a kind of a phrase you hear a lot, right? They were working very hard, long shifts, break time being cancelled, full mobilization, huge pressure to hit key performance targets, time response targets, huge pressure. So yes, my short answer is I think it was a short-lived thing, and I think paramedics are broadly respected anyway, but there's this longer-term issue of the general grind and the general intense pressure on not just paramedics but many parts of NHS. People are facing real challenges in their working lives, and I think they'd rather have that acknowledged rather than say, a clap or appearing on a TV show. It's not quite the same, right? It's not really real.
Yeah, well, should we just stay there just for a little bit longer around that? Because yeah, the work is very clearly and very obviously demanding and challenging for physical health and psychological health also for many reasons. So what would you say from your research around what the biggest personal challenges are for being a paramedic?
There's many, and I think one is, you mentioned physical. A lot of people don't make it to the standard retirement age of 65. They go out earlier on sickness related early retirement. So physical injuries from lifting would be a classic one, right? Many people will be aware of that. It's exhausting. I've heard people talking about having joint pain, being physically tired, getting too old. They'll say, it's kind of, it's a physically demanding role, and it's like, can I handle this in my 50s and 60s? Many people face that issue. There's the psychological issue is a super complex. So there's a whole chapter of the book that looks at this really, and it's quite heavy going reading in parts, but it's a lot of people opened up to me about the scale of the psychological risks that they face, right? So these can range from, many people in the public might assume that comes from attending really frightening or dangerous or traumatic calls. Now that certainly is part of it. Most people who've had any time in the ambulance service will have several calls that they'll never forget, right? And sometimes for bad reasons. They'll go to a call that was awful, just an awful, upsetting scene. And that is stressful. There's no doubt that's stressful. There's no doubt that's not normal. You won't come across that in most jobs, right? In most callings, most professions, you won't be exposed to that. So that's certainly part of it. What I found kind of more interesting, and maybe in a way more worrisome, is that it wasn't necessarily that people reported was causing them stress and causing them needing time out. It was more if they were psychologically unwell and struggling with their mental well-being. They often said it was more to do with organisational issues, actually. And yes, they remember some awful jobs where they were upset by for several weeks or months. But what was more troubling often was the relentless pressure, right? And just thinking, am I up for this? Can I do this again tomorrow? Can I do this again for a run of nights, next week? Am I well enough to do this? Am I switched on? Am I capable? There was a lot of people talking about feeling they just needed a longer rest. And so the stresses, psychological stressors related to things like fear of making a mistake, fear of complaints, in some cases, fear of what they saw as unsupportive management structures. There was a lot of talk about that. People that often say the local level station management was fine, and the local supervisor, they'd know them and they'd see them regularly, and they'd be out on the road with these guys, men and women regularly. What they were more worried about was the kind of larger organizational structure, this kind of monolithic structure of the ambulance trust itself, that they didn't understand how it worked. They'd say that the managers are remote, the managers don't understand us, all they care about is their response time targets. And there was a lack of care. People spoke of kind of a lack of care in the work. So this feeling devalued thing, that's where that comes from. If you want workers to be unsatisfied at work, then a classic way to do that is to make them feel neglected, make them feel unrecognized. It's one of the number one complaints of any workplace. Yeah. People say, no one knows what I do here. No one knows who I am. No one said thank you to me for years. No one seems to know or care what I can do. Or, that's the thing that I think the emotional and psychological strain, a lot of it came from organizational factors, which was a surprising thing to me to learn, because again, I'd assumed it would have come from the kind of rawness of the job and the nasty traumatic incidents, and they were definitely part of it. But I think a bigger part, a more chronic part, was the organizational stresses, which maybe something could be done about those, right? Yeah, ambulance service is going to expose you to traumatic jobs from time to time. That's inevitable. And to the extent you can prepare for that, and to some extent people would offset that by saying, this is what it's about. This is what we do. This is a genuine emergency. We all did our best at that call, and it was a privilege to be there, that sort of thing. Whereas the day-to-day organizational grind, that's less of a thing. It's kind of, if you know what I'm saying, it's kind of less an obvious thing. People are more upset about that than they were about the traumatic calls in many ways, because the traumatic calls go to the heart of what the emergency service is about. And so you can't do much about those. You're going to get those. Whereas the organizational factors, they don't have to be there. The workplace could be made more dignified. The managers could be more supportive. The key performance targets could be changed to make them more realistic. They're based on broadly based on 1970s ideas of a rapid response system, which doesn't really capture the reality of an ambulance service today. Things like that, they're causing stress, and they maybe can be dealt with. Maybe we can modify those.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that kind of those operational pressures and the response times and that huge demand and if we've got time, everyone's seen the stark images of the ambulances parked outside A&E. We might have some time to come back to that. Just one question from what you've been saying there is how a paramedic might say, how am I going to do all this again tomorrow? How am I going to come back for another 12, 13, 14 hours of this tomorrow? But so what do you think? What is it that keeps the paramedic coming back to work every day to do that job?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that was the weird thing. So you'd get a lot of complaints, a lot of moaning and joking and cynical comments, loads of that, right? Loads of self-deprecating comments about the workplace and about the patients in private. They'll be joking about, we've been called out for calls that are pointless and you won't believe what I just went to. There's no way that was an emergency, etc., etc. There'll be lots of that. Then in the next breath, they can talk about how much they love the job, right? So again, not uncommon in a workplace, the kind of love-hate relationship with the work, right? There's bits of every job you'll complain about, but there's other bits that you love and they're central to you as a core part of who you are. And I think it goes back to what I said a moment ago. Why they come back for more, most of them, is that there's something very powerful in that identity and not knowing what you'll get the next day. I think if you are very beaten down by it and you're in a bad way and you're not happy and not healthy, then all that uncertainty is probably very bad for you. I think if you're struggling and then turn up to 12-hour shift where you could get any kind of call next, that's probably not a safe place to be in terms of kind of psychological safety. However, if you are in a good place, people look forward to that they book on and say, right, let's see what's out there. Let's see what we get. And it's fun, right? Parts of it are fun. One of my interviewees said that exactly. He was saying, he was recounting a story, typical shift, nothing particularly exciting happening or particularly noteworthy, but he's like cleared off from the hospital with his teammate in the cab, just pootling along the road, waiting for the next call to come up. And he kind of turns to his workmate, his crewmate, and says, "This is fun, isn't it?" And it's like, yeah, this is all right. I'm enjoying this, and it's kind of, there were times when it was fun, and the kind of swapping of stories, the helping people, figuring out some weird problem. How do we get this person down the stairs? We'll work it out. We'll figure it out. It's like very direct, immediate thing very versatile, practical, problem-solving type people. I found them to be, and that was interesting, right? Because, you know, again, many other workplaces, you know, the atmosphere can be dismal. You know, people are bored, people are wasting time, people are thinking about doing something else. They're thinking of leaving, they're waiting around for their holiday to kick in, right? There was obviously some of that in the ambulance service, but I think a lot of the people, it's just very, very engaging, fully engaged, right? It's certainly not a boring life, you know, and I think that's a part of it. So helping the public, having that identity of the green uniform and the vehicles, being part of something that's there to help society, not just to make a profit or not just to sell some product or service that, you know, you're involved in something super important. And there's this kind of interesting culture. It's this kind of, the culture is seductive. It's interesting to have experienced and witnessed some of it, and to listen to the way they talk to one another and rely on one another. There's a powerful bond there. Again, you're not going to get that in most workplaces. Also, one other little thing, I suppose, was it makes people very philosophical as well. I think I mentioned this to you the other week. There would be, you learn an enormous amount from that environment, right? When you've been, I mean, this is probably also true for other caring occupations. You know, you see that people in crisis, you see the kind of rawness of the edges of the society, right? And you experience people's traumas, accidents, illness, sadness, loneliness, but also maybe the joy of a new baby arriving, or the relief of being you know, basically someone makes a recovery, and, you know, you see that someone described some calls as, you know, if you can recover a patient from a terrible cardiac crisis, you know, it's miraculous, someone said. You know, I mean, that's amazing, right? To have that kind of view. So this philosophical thing, you know, you've experienced kind of a really powerful kind of rawness of human existence, and people can reflect on that, and you learn a great deal about other people. You learn that you get to kind of empathize with what other people have gone through. You learn as a person, you grow as a person. You know, it's hard, and there's times when they get beaten down by it, and they need time out, and they're ill and can't really cope, and need some help, need some intervention, need some therapy. That's absolutely the case, and the chapter 5 goes into that in all of the depth of that, and it's parts of that is quite upsetting. But the flip side is all these things. You come back because you learn. It's an amazing area to learn as a person, become a philosophical person, a rounded person. Would you agree with that, Liz? Is that, I mean, you've lived this life, right? I've just observed it and written about it and listened to people, but is that resonating with you, that philosophical element, the coming back for more?
Yes, yeah, and it does. You know, as I said, I've grown up in the ambulance service, and so it is the green uniform. That is my identity. That is who I am, and I'm sure it has absolutely shaped the type of person that I am today. And somebody that I recently became friends with, she's a new friend to me, and she said to me, "You don't do drama, do you?" And I'm like, well, no, not really, because nothing is really ever as bad as people at first seem, is it? There's always somebody or something that's happening that is just far, far worse. So no, I don't tend to do drama, as you know, Leo.
No, that's good. That's good to know. I wish I could be more like that. I do drama, and yeah, I need to learn more about how to handle that. Right? It's interesting. It's something that I've certainly reflected on, but it's easier said than done, right? But it is an element of that. I can certainly relate to that issue of people who, empathizing with others in a much more vulnerable position than yours. It's something that all of us can do more to understand.
And often when you tell people you're a paramedic, they'll say, "Well, I couldn't do your job." And I think, "Oh, well, sure, but what do you think, Leo? Could you, after all this time, could you be a paramedic?"
No, I don't think I could. No, I don't think I'd be able to handle that responsibility of it. I think I'd find that very, very difficult. I think academic world is very, very different. You're asked to be highly critical of everything and to deconstruct everything and think it all through and write about it. That's what we do, and that's an interesting set of skills to have, and to teach that it's a nice thing to be able to do, right? But that very practical, solve this thing right now, not sure that's me, really. I think I would struggle with that a great deal, because maybe academics aren't the most practical of people, right? So a bit, maybe generalizing a little bit. But yeah, that thing about I couldn't do your job. I've heard that from loads of patients said that, and bystanders, and it's a classic thing people say. The other thing they ask is, what's the worst thing you've seen? It's like, well, why are you asking that? You don't really, trust me, you don't really want to know, right? But there was that element. But yeah, I couldn't do this job. I bet you see everything out there. So, yes. I mean, these are things bystanders ask. Yeah, that I couldn't do your job isn't quite right, because if you are suited, I mean, you can learn to cope, and I think a lot of students probably feel that when they start, right? I didn't speak to any students really, but I imagine paramedic students, to some extent, they're thrown into this quite early on, and have to cope with it and deal with it. I think most of them do. I think most of them enjoy it and are very keen to get out on the road, right? And they value that experience hugely. But you can cope and you can adapt. A lot of the calls are pretty straightforward, actually, right? So some of the other guys said this, in particularly one interview, I can remember him saying this. Most of the job is easy. So, easy, really? I'm not sure I'd say it's easy, but that's what he said. That's the word he used. You've always got backup. You can always, if things do get difficult, there's always that option of taking the person to hospital. You've got a clinical desk to help you, to talk you through particular calls. These elements have maybe grown, right? I mean, you are on your own in a sense, but there is this structure of expertise above that can be called upon, right? So really complicated cases, other crews can arrive to help. I spoke to some more senior people in the service who took a slightly more optimistic view, and you can imagine they would, right? But you speak to people like consultant paramedic type level, and they would say things like, yeah, the crews complain and they say the managers aren't available, and they complain about being left to their own devices, and they claim that the crews are remote and aren't cared for. But trust me, there's more support available now than there's ever been in terms of a clinical resource, more expertise to call upon. If you go to a really difficult clinical case, you can ask for advice in a way that you didn't have in the 1990s and earlier, when you were on your own, much more so. So yeah, you can do it. People can do it, and we have to think about that growth. Are people? I think very soon people will leave if it's not for them. But you do get a lot of people staying the course for many years and becoming a paramedic and doing it for 20 years, operational for 20 years, right? So it can be done, and it's important not to be too pessimistic about that. I mean, people can do it, and people can learn and adapt and grow, and that's true of any challenging profession. You can overcome those fears and those periods of time when you're not coping. You can learn and grow. It's not all pessimistic. And I talk about that a bit more in chapter 6. I get out of the kind of doom and gloom of chapter 5. Chapter 6 speaks much more to that, about the opportunity for growth that exists in the paramedic world that maybe wasn't there 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's absolutely and the ambulance service can absolutely be a rewarding career from start to finish, most certainly. And I think where we'll go with the conversation now is on that that clinical development. So I come from a generation where, for example, we didn't read ECGs, and we didn't recognise heart attacks in the community. So within my career, ECG recognition and MI or heart attack diagnosis in the field, in someone's house, it came from a position of where, can paramedics do that? Are paramedics able to recognise a heart attack and read an ECG? Oh, we're not sure. That would be from the medical profession, obviously. But we've come through that. We've learned it, and now I would suggest that heart attack care in the UK is one really huge success story in terms of how that's dealt with by the paramedic profession now. So would you agree with that, and tell us more about that clinical development?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really, really important one. And so this idea of giving the paramedic more autonomy, more discretion, better training to identify these various patterns, and to then, rather than take every patient to the accident and emergency unit, they can bypass the A&E unit and take them straight to a specialist PPCI suite, which is the kind of angioplasty process for a lot of these types of calls, right? Which is much less invasive, much better outcomes, very quick, broadly available, 24/7. All of these cities in Britain will have one or maybe more of these centres that can be used for a crew. A crew have got the autonomy to go there and take, identify that particular type of cardiac emergency, take the patient directly to that facility. And it was actually this where the gentleman mentioned that word miraculous. It was in relation to these kinds of calls where you see someone who's potentially on the verge of a very serious emergency, and then hours later, well, not even hours later, but within an hour or two, in recovery, and with probably very good prospects to lead a very ordinary life post emergency, right? Whereas again, as you say, 15 years ago, the outcomes for out of hospital cardiac emergency were very, very poor. Now they're improving. You've reached a stage where people talk of the gold standard. And this couldn't have happened if we didn't take the decision to upskill the paramedic role and give the paramedic that discretion in the field to identify that type of emergency and to mobilize the right response to it. That's been an amazing change. Strokes as well, there's been changes in stroke care, which again is along similar kinds of lines, which is again part of the increasing capacity of the ambulance service. I mean, now there used to be this phrase scoop and run, which kind of spoke to the old-fashioned pad and bandage first aid and transportation model. That's very, very dated now. I mean, some calls are kind of like that, but overall, he's spending a lot of time on scene, a lot of time working with that patient, figuring out the best possible way through the NHS system, right? Where do we go next? Yeah, more autonomy, more clinical decision-making. That's been very interesting to see. The ambulance now will probably carry about 40 or so drugs. I think I'm right in saying that's way more expansive than used to be. There will be, if you look at the kind of clinical protocols, it's almost like a kind of a manual of operations. It's like 450 pages, something like that, the latest one. That's a lot of clinical knowledge invested in that role. And that's important. I mean, we can't ignore that. That's people spoke with a lot of pride about that. And so I suppose that's it. This goes back to the conceptual thing I started with about the move from an occupation to profession. A profession starts to claim knowledge over what it can do, right? Years gone by, the paramedics didn't have that, and the ambulance service didn't have that. And it was kind of granted to them by other professionals. You're allowed to do these little bits, but no more. There's still parts of that, of course, but over time, the paramedics have started to grow that capacity, and they've done well. They've shown they can handle that capacity. I think a lot of them want more. A lot of them talk about we could be even further. We could have broader clinical discretion, a wider clinical scope of practice, right? Prescribing has been a big thing the last few years, obviously, right? And now some of the advanced paramedics have got certain prescribing capabilities now. The profession can grow further. It can become not only more clinically versatile in the field, but it can also think about its hierarchy. What can we do? This idea of people retiring early, all that expertise, rather than being clinical operational all the time, can we do something more with that clinical ability they have? Can we find other roles for them? Maybe not just in the ambulance service, but elsewhere in the care economy, right? They're highly skilled, versatile clinicians. Rather than being on a vehicle all their working life, that's a big demand to be placed on a person. But when they reach a certain level of seniority, could find out other places to put them in the healthcare economy, and that's interesting. So you've got, in a way, the profession outgrowing the employer to a degree, right? And I talk about that in the book too. That's kind of interesting. So no profession should be completely tied to its employers, right? A professional, to some degree, should be able to kind of move on and move around and kind of almost like trade off in terms of where it can operate. And you're seeing that too. People leaving the ambulance service, on some ways that's a worry because you've got shortages, etc., right? And it's certainly a worry of people leaving because they're miserable with the employer. That's a big problem, right? But the flip side is if you've got a more advanced professional people, they're employable elsewhere. They can put their skills to good use elsewhere. So we should look at that as well. I think that's quite an important development. Paramedics aren't all in the ambulance service. Yeah, most are, but they're moving into other parts of the care economy, which is very interesting and something I hadn't really anticipated before I started looking at them.
Yeah, I think that might have gone some way to answering Jim's question about the profession managing to separate itself and become distinct from the ambulance services in terms of professional identity and arguably professional leadership.
That's a great question. I think it's very uncertain at the moment. It's very much an unfolding story. It is kind of an odd thing to think of a paramedic not on a vehicle or not on a helicopter, right? But in a way, it's an absolutely correct part of their trajectory to be employable in other settings. So what is that core purpose? Is there a core purpose? And I've had discussions with several people about this, and it comes back to what are we specialists in? What is our offer to the public, right? And that's a kind of a weird thing. And I think I discussed this towards the end of the book, and I don't have a clear answer, but it comes to something when the ambulance service, when the paramedics rather have moved on to a position where they're not synonymous with NHS ambulance trusts. So that suggests progress, but there's limits around that in a sense of mustn't lose sight of that ability to respond. Someone said in the book, there's a particular interview with someone who talks about what is our key offer to the public. It's that ability to respond. What does that mean exactly? And I've tried to unravel that a bit. And I think there's something very powerful there. The paramedics are experts in working in an unfiltered, raw environment that is like super core to what they're good at. That's not the only thing they're good at, but that's something they have that lots of other clinical specialisms maybe don't have, or don't have in quite the same capacity. So I'd be wary of losing that. It would be strange to have a paramedic who, it wouldn't be strange, but you wouldn't want all paramedics moving out of that environment, right? Because that's where they can often do their most good, So it's an interesting balancing act. I suppose it speaks to that thing. If you don't want to do the whole thing, the same thing all your career, right? It makes no sense. You should be rotating, moving into different areas, learning more, have more flexibility about where we can deploy paramedics and where they can work, where they can learn. I think a lot of them struggle once you're in the ambulance service. Is that the target times, the relentless demands, the time for learning is often not there. Once they've got the degree, once they're employed, they don't have that much training, not much training opportunities. That's got to change. We've got to figure out a way to change that. Gives people time off the clock, time off the roster to develop and to rest and reflect. I think they need that. And if you're a professional, you get a bit more autonomy over your time. That's what you guys don't really have as much as you should have at this point, I think. A lot of people struggling with that element. Yes, I've graduated. Yes, I'm a paramedic. I'm pleased with that. But where's my time for learning and reflection and development? A profession should have that.
Yeah, and you'll have seen how difficult that is. That's what you're saying in terms of the relentlessness of the work and the high demand, and that is, we've seen it even more so now than it was. I'm sure you saw it back then with your research. And is there anything that's come out around that you can share with us in terms of potential solutions, or what's wrong, or why is everyone ping-ponging around?
Yeah, it's been an issue for a long time, and the handovers is particularly serious now, and has been a growing problem even before the pandemic, and now it's a very, very serious issue. And you mentioned it yourself, the queues of ambulances outside A&E units waiting to try and offload their patients, and that means they're not available to go to other calls that then start to stack elsewhere in the system, right? That's a very, very serious challenge. I don't see enough effort from government to address. Frankly, that needs to change. That is a major crisis that we have, and we've been living through for several years, and it's not good enough. We need to figure out a way of sorting that out. In terms of answers, I don't know. I speculate a little bit, and one thing I've been thinking about a lot is, what is the overall design of this system? No one's ever sat down and tried to map it and structure it, right? That's happened by evolution over time, and it's evolved into something that doesn't make a lot of sense. No one would have designed it this way. I think there's an awful lot of calls that don't require an ambulance response, to be absolutely blunt with you. There's too many at the very lowest level of acuity that should be handled in the community. The issue being, it's not handled in the community, right? The GP service is very busy. The GP-led walking service is too busy, etc. People can't get an appointments. They're worried about some health condition or psychiatric condition, whatever it might be. They call 111 advice line. That is often seen. There's debates around this, but a lot of the paramedics would say it's too risk averse. So 111 will escalate it to a call out, which wasn't really necessary. So this is all adding to the demand. It seems to me the ambulance service is very good at taking on more and more demand, not so good at trying to push that demand away onto others. It kind of feels that it can't do that. And that's part of the emergency service DNA, right? It's like, it's an emergency. Well, we've got to send something, but what do we send and when and how long is the wait going to be? This is a big, big challenge. So I was thinking about this a bit in terms of structuring that demand load. Asking an ambulance service to basically do 3 types of call strikes me as problematic. So I say 3 types, 3 very broad areas of work. One is traditional life-threatening emergencies and illness. Fine, that's ambulance service all over. Fine, you do that work. The psychiatric calls, I think some of them maybe would make sense for the ambulance service to be involved in, but many of them aren't really correct for that. Quite hard to fix those calls with an ambulance response. I spoke to a police officer about this. Remember, police face this same issue too. Remember one gentleman saying, we need another ambulance service. We need a psych crisis. We need another number, another 999 branch. We have fire, ambulance, police, cave rescue, mountain rescue. We need psych rescue. I think he may be right about that. We could have some redesign of that, having a specific element of the emergency provision for that, alongside all of the much longer term care that people with mental health illnesses need, right? It stores up, the problem stores up and becomes an emergency. It needs to be dealt with earlier in the pattern, right? Earlier intervention, more care in the community, like genuine care. There's lots of holes in that psychiatric well-being sort of safety net and health provision. It's very, very patchy. It's not, there's holes in there. So it defaults to ambulance service. And then the third area of work is this unplanned primary care. Again, paramedics can handle a lot of those calls very, very well, right? I mean, you're more clinically advanced, you can deal with those calls, but should they be organized on a 999 response basis? I don't think so. A lot of them, no. A lot of them don't make sense to be delivered that way. So where else in the health system can we build up capacity? And things like district nurses, GP home visits, that sort of thing. We need a lot more of that to even out the workload. The workload, a lot of it is falling on the ambulance service. And I think that's unfair. I think it's we need to find a way to ration that demand out into more reasonable ways of delivering. But that's a huge area of work. And I mean, that's for someone else to look at in much more depth, I think.
Yeah, but yes, arguably you're correct, but it's really interesting to hear your insights and what you think are the challenges from your time inside the ambulance sector. So we're coming up to the last few minutes, Leo. I think we've answered a few of people's questions just kind of indirectly as you've been going along. So that's all right. There are a few that we haven't managed to answer, but I'm probably gonna give the last couple of minutes to Lawrence. And Lawrence has asked a few questions and so thanks for that, and made a comment around expose it to life at the sharp end gives paramedics a profound connection with the gritty reality of life. I would agree. But earlier on he asked a question, so how do you think that the contemporary healthcare landscape, the expectations and experiences of paramedics and the student paramedics will shape the professional identity? And you've got like 3 minutes.
Well, I think we have to balance out the optimism with the pessimism and think that through a bit more. A lot of people speak about people's expectations not being met by the role, right? And that was interesting, and I talk about that in the book a bit too. But particularly with this unplanned primary care, what is the ambulance service for? If you've done a degree in paramedic science and you're recruited to an ambulance service post, you want to do the most of you, use those skills the best way you can. I think people are becoming frustrated that that balance, as I said, the balance of the call out, the styles of the calls they're getting aren't quite right. They don't quite match the expectations. And I think that requires a lot of work. The optimistic side of it is that this is a role where you get to play an important role in society. It's a secure job. It's a job, it's in demand, the skills are in demand. The graduates find work quickly, usually. The degrees are very popular. There's a lot of interest in the role. And we have to leverage that, right? It's a trusted profession. A lot of professions aren't trusted. Right? A lot of professions have a bad reputation. Paramedics broadly have a very good reputation. And it's a valuable and rewarding profession. I just worry it's being asked to do too much. It's personally and organizationally a bit too demanding. And if we can find a way somehow with some policy changes to kind of smooth out that workload and rethink the commissioning structures, et cetera, the kind of background infrastructure of it all is strange. The performance management system is outdated and based on old-fashioned models. So there's a lot that could be looked at and reformed. It doesn't seem to be a government priority. And I think that needs to change through the kind of lobbying that you and others are doing and trying to create a bit of interest around that. It's, things could be done. So more attention needs to be paid to this issue if we're ever going to fix it. But there are reasons for optimism too, as I said before, about this being an important role, an in-demand role, and a meaningful role. A lot of people's work is not perceived as meaningful. This is meaningful and it's important, and it's a profession it's an area of profound interest, and we have to keep that in mind and build on that.
Thank you, Leo. And I know you struggled with the book and how you portrayed the profession and portrayal versus betrayal. You wanted to present the whole profession in all its glory, the good and the bad. So, and I think you've done an amazing job, and thank you for showing an interest and into my profession, which is very special to me, and I don't think you've done an amazing job, so I don't need to worry about that. From one paramedic anyway to you.
Thank you. That's very nice for you to say so. I appreciate that, Alice. Thank you, and thank you for today. So great hosting of the session, and great that you were able to find the time to do it. So thank you.
No problem. So that's it for this session. We've been recording, so a recording of the event will be available on the York Festival YouTube channel, so you can watch that back again later. And I know that in the chat has gone the link to buy Leo's book, which I have a copy right here, which is amazing. You'll find more information on the festival website, or a huge different range of events that are going on at York Festival Ideas, something to interest everyone really. And just if you've got any comments or ideas, there's obviously the social media channels, #York Ideas. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks again, Leo.